The courtroom doors opened, and two people walked in that no one in Greystone County had expected. A young white man in a charcoal suit carrying a legal briefcase, and a young white woman with a press badge clipped to her lapel and a manila folder pressed against her chest. They did not pause in the doorway. They did not scan the gallery for seats. They walked directly to the defense table, where a black man in a county-issue gray shirt sat with his wrists resting in front of him, and they sat down on either side of him like they had always belonged there. The prosecutor, a measured man named Douglas Albright, leaned toward his assistant and said something too quiet for the gallery to hear. His assistant shook her head slowly. Nobody in that room knew the answer yet. But the answer, when it came, would reach back 22 years, to a cold parking lot in Clarksville, Tennessee, and a man who made a choice that the world told him was not his to make. Before any of that, though, before the verdict and the witness who almost didn't speak, and the truth that had been buried under contracts and company letterhead for 6 years, we need to go back. Back to a man named Raymond Cole. Back to the winter it all started. Raymond was 34 years old when the story begins. He worked maintenance at Bridgeford Industrial, a sheet metal fabrication plant on the eastern edge of Clarksville, Tennessee, the kind of work that left grease under your fingernails on days you weren't even at the plant, and a low persistent ache in your lower back that you stopped noticing, because noticing it didn't make it go away. He had been married once to a woman named Carol, who used to leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror with small observations about the world, things she found funny or strange or worth keeping. She died of a stroke when Raymond was 31. He had taken down the last note she ever left, a small yellow square that said "The birds outside are arguing again," folded it carefully, and put it in the inside pocket of the jacket he wore to her funeral. He had not worn that jacket since, but he had not gotten rid of it either. They never had children, Raymond and Carol. The house they had shared in the Riverside district of Clarksville had 4 rooms, and after she was gone, he stopped going into 2 of them. He went to work, came home, sat on the back steps with a cup of coffee, and watched the sun drop behind the tree line at the edge of the yard. His neighbors knew him by name. A few of them waved, none of them knocked. That was the shape of his life on a Tuesday evening in early March when he pulled into the parking lot of Hartfield's grocery on his way home from a double shift and almost didn't stop. He needed cooking oil. Cooking oil was on sale. That was the whole calculation. He saw them before he even reached the entrance. 2 children sitting on the concrete base of a parking lot light pole, a boy and a girl, both white, both in jackets that were not built for the temperature. The boy looked about 8. The girl, smaller, maybe 6. The boy had his arm around his sister, and he was not looking around for help, not crying, not performing distress for passing adults. He was simply there, holding her steady, with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that drawing attention does not always produce good results. Raymond slowed. Something about the way the boy held himself, contained and watchful, made Raymond stop walking before he had decided to stop. He crouched down to their level. "You two waiting on someone?" The boy looked up at him. His eyes were gray, and they carried something in them that eyes that age are not supposed to carry yet. "Our uncle dropped us off," the boy said. "He said he was going to find parking. That was a long time ago." Raymond looked at the parking lot. It was 43 spaces. There was no one in it that wasn't loading groceries into a car and leaving. He learned the rest in pieces, standing in that parking lot with the temperature dropping and a security light buzzing overhead. Their mother had died 11 days earlier. Cause of death that the boy reported with flat accuracy was what the doctor said was heart failure. Their father had not been in their lives since the girl was an infant. A maternal uncle, a man named Derek, who the boy described with the careful neutrality children use for people they are afraid of, had taken them in temporarily after the funeral. He had brought them here 2.5 hours ago and had not come back. Raymond called the police. He went inside the store, bought 2 hot chocolates from the deli counter, and sat with the children on the concrete base of that parking lot light while they waited. When the cruiser arrived 12 minutes later, 2 officers stepped out, and both of them looked at Raymond first, a black man sitting in the dark beside 2 white children, before they looked at the children at all. One officer's hand went to his radio. The others went lower. "Sir, what is your relationship to these children?" Raymond explained. He explained carefully and completely, and when he finished the first officer looked at him, the way people look at a story that fits together correctly, but that they still don't fully trust, the way you check a lock twice, even when you heard it click. Raymond gave his name, his employee ID from the plant, his home address. He explained again. The boy, whose name was Nathan, told all the officers that the man had bought them hot chocolate and had not gone anywhere. The girl, whose name was Claire, had not said a word since Raymond sat down beside them. Before the officers put the children in the back of the cruiser, Claire turned and looked at Raymond through the window. The glass was cold and slightly fogged at the edges. One of the officers leaned in through the front door and asked her in a gentle voice if the man outside had done anything to make her feel unsafe. Claire shook her head. She pressed one small hand against the glass and said, in a voice that barely carried through it, "He stayed." It was the first thing she had said in 2.5 hours. Raymond drove home. He went to work the next morning. He came home, sat on the back steps, drank his coffee, watched the tree line. He told himself what any reasonable person would tell themselves, that the children were in the system now, that the system existed for exactly this situation, that whatever happened next was not his responsibility and never had been. He told himself that for 7 weeks. Then a woman from his church named Agnes, who worked part-time in the county's family services office, mentioned over coffee after the Sunday service that 2 children matching the description he had given her one evening, without quite intending to, had already been moved through 4 separate foster placements in less than 2 months. No family would take both of them, and the boy, Nathan, refused to be separated from his sister. Every placement that tried to take only one of them would find Nathan sitting at the front door of whatever house he was in, not crying, not speaking, just sitting until someone called social services to come get him. The file was getting thick, Agnes said, and thick files don't find homes. Raymond filed the paperwork on a Wednesday morning before his shift. He did not tell anyone in advance. He simply drove to the county family court offices at 7:14 a.m., stood at the window, and asked for the forms. The social worker assigned to his case was a woman in her mid-50s named Barbara Weston, and she looked at him across her desk with an expression she was clearly working to keep professional. "Mr. Cole, I want to make sure I understand the situation. You're a single man, you live alone." She glanced at the file, "and these children are white. You're aware of that?" "I'm aware," Raymond said. "And your position at Bridgeford Industrial is hourly maintenance work." Raymond looked at her. "I'm aware of my job too." The family court judge ordered 4 home inspections instead of the standard 2. 3 of Raymond's neighbors, black men and women who had lived on the same street as Raymond for years, pulled him aside in the weeks that followed. One of them, an older man named Earl, put a hand on Raymond's arm outside of church and said, "Ray, I know your heart is in the right place. But a black man taking in 2 white kids in this county, that's a fight you cannot win. You're just going to get hurt, and so will they." Raymond listened. He nodded. He filed the next round of paperwork the following Monday. It took 8 months. 8 months of background checks and interviews and home visits at times that were not convenient, and questions that circled the same unspoken suspicion, the way water circles a drain, always moving, never quite saying what they were actually asking. But on a Thursday morning in November, a judge signed the order, and Raymond Cole became the legal guardian, and then the legal father, of Nathan and Claire. That first night he set up the small bedroom at the end of the hall. 2 beds, a reading lamp he had picked up from a second-hand shop, a bookshelf he had built over the previous weekend from pine boards, and finishing nails, the kind of project that takes longer than it should and comes out slightly uneven and feels exactly right for that reason. Claire fell asleep before 9 o'clock, the sleep of someone who has been awake for much longer than a single day. Nathan lay in his bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Raymond checked on them before he turned in. He stood in the doorway. Nathan's eyes found his in the dark. "Are you going to be here in the morning?" It was not quite a question. It was something else, an equation being checked. Raymond did not answer with words. He pulled the wooden chair from the corner of the room, carried it to the space beside Nathan's bed, and sat down. He sat there the entire night. When Nathan woke at 6:17 the next morning, Raymond was still in the chair, his head tilted back, asleep, one hand resting on his knee. Nathan looked at him for a long time. Then he pulled his blanket up over his shoulder and went back to sleep. Something in his face, in the set of his jaw, had changed. Just slightly. The way a window changes when someone opens it a crack after a long winter. The years that followed were not easy, and they were not supposed to be. A black single father raising two white children in Clarksville, Tennessee, was not a sentence that produced warm reactions from anyone, regardless of which side of any line they stood on. People who did not approve had their reasons. People who approved in theory found the reality more complicated than the theory. The first day of school was not the worst, but it was the most instructive. Raymond walked Nathan and Claire through the front entrance of Riverside Elementary, one hand holding each of theirs. The administrative assistant at the welcome desk smiled at the children and then looked up at Raymond and said, brightly, "Are you their driver today?" "I'm their father," Raymond said. The smile remained but reorganized itself around something it had not been designed to hold. A woman near the sign-in table, another parent, saw the three of them together and took a small sideways step, drawing her own child closer in a motion so practiced she probably wasn't aware she'd done it. That afternoon, Nathan sat at the kitchen table without touching his after-school snack. Raymond pulled out the chair across from him and sat down so they were at eye level. "Why do people look at us like that?" Nathan said. Not like he was complaining. Like he was running a calculation. Raymond thought about it before he answered. Because they haven't seen this before. But something being uncommon doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it uncommon. And somebody has to be first. Nathan considered this. Then he picked up his apple and ate it. There were other moments, harder ones. When Claire was 10 and Nathan was 12, Raymond attended a school board open forum that he had marked on his kitchen calendar 3 weeks in advance. He wore a clean shirt. He brought a folder. He had learned by then to bring a folder, because a black father at a white school always needs to be able to show his work. A woman named Patricia Holloway stood up during the public comment period. She was the kind of parent who sat on 3 committees simultaneously, and whose opinion moved through the school community the way weather moves through a valley, fast and total. She looked at Raymond from across the room and said, in the measured tone of someone who has practiced making cruelty sound like concern, "Has anyone from Child Services conducted a recent review of this arrangement? Because a single black man raising 2 white children, I would think there would be protocols." The room did not quite go silent. But the ambient noise changed in quality, the way the sound of a room changes when everyone decides at the same moment to stop moving. Raymond felt 30 pairs of eyes settle on him. He could have left. He could have said something that would have given Patricia Holloway the reaction she was angling for. Instead, he opened his folder, removed 2 sheets of paper, and placed them on the table in front of him. Nathan's academic record and Claire's. Straight A's for 4 consecutive terms. Teacher comments that used words like exceptional, thoughtful, and one teacher's note that said simply, "This child is going to be okay." "This is the only answer I have," Raymond said. "And it's the only one that matters." No one said anything. Patricia Holloway picked up her water bottle and looked at the table. But the moment that stayed with Raymond, the one he carried in his chest like a stone that never quite warmed up, came when Claire was 16. Raymond had driven to her high school to pick her up from after-school drama practice. He waited in the parking lot the way he always did, leaning against the truck, watching the doors. When Claire came out with a group of friends, one of the girls pointed at Raymond and said something. Claire glanced at him and then back at her friend and said, in a voice she did not think carried far enough to matter, "He's our housekeeper." Nathan heard about it the same evening from a classmate who had been there. He found Claire in the kitchen, and his voice was flat and precise and 17 years old and absolutely certain. "He's our father, Claire. Our father. How could you say that?" Claire's voice broke. "You don't know what it's like. No one asks you every single day why your dad is black. No one says things in the hallway about our family like we're some kind of experiment." Raymond was in the hallway. He heard every word. He did not walk into the kitchen. He walked out the back door, sat down on the back steps with his coffee cup, and stayed there until the yard was completely dark. It was the only time in 22 years of raising those 2 children that Raymond allowed himself to wonder whether loving them the way he did was something they would one day need to recover from. 2 days later, Claire found him in the garage sorting through boxes of old hardware. She stood in the doorway for a while before she spoke. "I'm sorry, Dad. I was scared. It was wrong." Raymond set down the box of hinges he was holding. "You're not wrong for being scared," he said. "You're only wrong if you let fear decide for you." Claire crossed the garage and put her arms around him the way she used to when she was 6 years old, standing in a parking lot with a cup of hot chocolate going cold in her hands. Raymond held on. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing else that needed to be said. That lesson, the one about fear and choices, was going to come back around. But not yet. There were good years woven through the hard ones. The Christmas when Claire was 12 and Nathan was 14, Bridgeford Industrial cut Raymond's hours down to 26 a week, and the math stopped working for presents. Raymond stayed up past 2 in the morning on Christmas Eve. He built Claire a new bookshelf from reclaimed wood he had picked up from the plant's scrap pile, sanded it smooth, and stained it the color of walnut. He repainted Nathan's old bicycle in a deep green that was close enough to new if you didn't look at the tires. On Christmas morning, Nathan unwrapped the bicycle and stood looking at it for a moment. He understood immediately what the paint meant and what it didn't mean, and what the hours behind it meant instead. He didn't say anything. He walked to Raymond and held on. Claire ran to her room and came back with a piece of cardboard from a cereal box, folded in half, with crayon drawings on the front. 3 people standing in front of a house, 1 tall and dark, 2 shorter and lighter, and written underneath in the handwriting of a 12-year-old who was still working out where to put her letters. 2 words: "Our family." Raymond put the card in his wallet. He would carry it there for the next 16 years, through every shift at Bridgeford, through every Sunday at First Baptist, through every quiet evening on the back steps watching the tree line go dark. It would still be there the night they arrested him. Nathan graduated from the University of Tennessee College of Law 15 years later. Top of his class. Raymond sat in the 3rd row wearing the suit he had bought secondhand for Carol's funeral, and had never had another reason to wear until this one. When Nathan stood at the podium to address the graduating class, he said, "I'm here because one man showed me what it looks like to do the right thing, when doing the easier thing was right there in front of him." Raymond put his head down. For the first time since Carol, he cried in front of other people. Claire was by then a senior investigative journalist at the Nashville Courier. Nathan was practicing civil rights law in Memphis. The 2 children who had sat in a cold parking lot with no one coming back for them had become, without fanfare and without anyone having planned it that way, exactly the kind of people Raymond had always believed they could be. And then the phone call came. It was a Monday evening, when everything that Raymond Cole had spent 22 years building was threatened with being taken away in the space of 48 hours. A man named Victor Greer, the operations director at Bridgeford Industrial, was found dead in the plant's secondary storage facility on the east side of the complex. Blunt force trauma. The police classified it as homicide within 6 hours. Within 2 days, Raymond Cole was sitting in a county jail interview room with his wrists on a metal table. The case against him was assembled from 3 pieces, and none of the 3 would have held much weight on its own. But together they were presented as something more solid than they were. First, the plant's electronic access system showed Raymond as the last employee to badge out on the night Victor Greer died. Second, Raymond and Victor Greer had clashed publicly, and on record 3 weeks earlier, when Raymond had discovered that Greer had been filing maintenance reports claiming equipment had been serviced and replaced when the actual equipment on the floor was original, rusted, and failing. Raymond had escalated the discrepancy to the company's regional safety director, which created a paper trail and made Raymond an inconvenient person for at least one individual in the Bridgeford management structure. Third, a night shift security guard named Dale Pruitt stated that he had observed Raymond near the storage facility around the time the coroner estimated Victor Greer had died. No forensic evidence, no murder weapon, no footage, a badge log, a documented argument, and one man's account from a distance in the dark across a facility that covered 3 acres. Raymond told the detectives what had happened. He had badged out, walked to his truck, realized he had left his thermos in the break room, and gone back inside to retrieve it. He had not gone anywhere near the storage facility. He had not seen Victor Greer that night. He had gone home and gone to sleep. The public defender assigned to his case was a thin man named Garvin, who arrived at the county jail with a briefcase that looked like it had more cases in it than hours available to work on them. He sat across from Raymond and said, "The district attorney is pushing for first-degree murder. Life without parole. My honest professional assessment is that you should consider a plea to voluntary manslaughter. 15 to 20 years. You'd likely serve 12. Raymond looked at him. "I didn't kill anyone, I understand that. But the jury pool in Greystone County is what it is. And the optics of a black man accused of killing a white manager, Mr. Cole, I have to be honest with you about the math." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned forward. "I have spent 22 years teaching my kids that you don't lie, and you don't hide, and you don't let fear choose for you. I am not pleading guilty to something I did not do. Not for 15 years. Not for 15 minutes." Garvin withdrew from the case 4 days before trial, citing a scheduling conflict that Raymond strongly suspected was something else entirely. Raymond went into trial without counsel and with a court date that was not moving. Claire got the call first. A man named Reverend Aldridge from their old church in Clarksville reached her cell phone on a Wednesday afternoon, while she was in the middle of her newsroom. "Claire," he said, "your father has been arrested. They're saying he killed a man at the plant." Claire left the newsroom with her coat half on and was on the highway within 20 minutes. Nathan got the news that same evening in Memphis, where he was 3 weeks deep into a civil rights case that had taken him most of a year to build. He pulled the court filings for Raymond's case on his laptop that night and read through the prosecution's evidence with the specific focus of a lawyer who is looking for the structure beneath the surface. And what he found was a structure that had been built quickly, on soft ground, by someone who was counting on no one looking too closely. He called Claire. "The whole case is circumstantial. 1 witness, 0 forensics. Someone wanted Dad to take the fall for something, and they needed it to move fast." Claire's voice on the other end of the line was very steady. "I know. I'm already in Clarksville." Nathan understood the risks of what he was about to do. Representing his own adoptive father in a murder trial would give the prosecution a gift: the ability to frame every argument he made as the product of personal loyalty rather than legal reasoning. But he also understood something that the risk calculation kept running into. No attorney in Greystone County was going to fight this case the way it needed to be fought. Not for Raymond Cole. Not against the Bridgeford name, which was on the donor plaques of 3 county buildings and 2 named wings of the regional hospital. If Raymond was going to get a real defense, it was going to have to come from the people who knew exactly what kind of man he was and had 22 years of evidence to prove it. Nathan and Claire met in the parking lot of a rest stop on I-24, halfway between Memphis and Clarksville, at 11:40 at night. They stood next to Nathan's car under a light that buzzed and flickered, and they made the decision in fewer words than you would expect from 2 people whose entire adult lives had been built on the careful use of language. They were going back. They were going to stand in a courtroom in a county that had been watching their family sideways for 2 decades. Not because it was safe. Not because the odds were good. Because Raymond Cole had spent 22 years demonstrating what it looked like to do the right thing when the wrong thing was right there and much easier, and neither of them was willing to be the person who failed to show up when it was his turn to need them. The trial of Raymond Cole began on a Monday morning in the Greystone County Superior Court. When Nathan walked to the defense table and placed his briefcase beside his father's chair and sat down and put one hand briefly on Raymond's shoulder, a ripple moved through the gallery. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds. In that courtroom, it carried the weight of 22 years. The prosecutor was a man named Douglas Albright. He had practiced law in Greystone County for 19 years, had a conviction rate the local paper mentioned every election cycle, and was the specific kind of effective that comes from knowing the room better than anyone in it. His opening statement was a careful piece of architecture. He never said the word race. He did not need to. He talked about access and opportunity, about a worker who had a documented conflict with a manager, about a man who was alone in a plant on the night that manager died. Every sentence was building something, and what it was building was a picture, and the picture was one this particular county had been recognizing for a very long time. Nathan stood for his opening and made a different choice. He did not tell a story. He asked a question. "Where is the physical evidence?" He said it quietly. He looked at each juror in turn. "You are going to hear about a badge swipe that proves my client went to work. You are going to hear about an argument that happened 3 weeks before this man died, and you are going to hear one witness describe what he believes he saw, at night, at a distance, across an active industrial facility. That is what the prosecution has. Not proof, a construction. And before this trial is over, I am going to ask you to look at what that construction is actually built on. 2 jurors shifted in their seats. Albright's pen stopped moving for a moment. The trial was young, but the direction of it was already being set. The prosecution's key witness took the stand on the second day. Dale Pruitt was the night security guard, whose account of seeing Raymond near the storage facility was the only thing that placed Raymond anywhere near where Victor Greer had died. He walked to the stand with the posture of a man who had been through this in his head many times. His direct testimony was clean and specific. He said that at approximately 10:20 on the night in question, he observed Raymond Cole walking in the direction of the secondary storage facility. He recognized him by his build and his walk. He had worked with Raymond for 4 years. He was certain. Nathan stood for cross-examination with a single printed document in his hand. It was an aerial layout of the Bridgeford Industrial facility, obtained from the county planning office. Mr. Pruitt, where exactly were you when you say you saw my client? At the East Gate monitoring station. Nathan held up the aerial layout so the jury could see it. The East Gate monitoring station is here. The secondary storage facility is here. He pointed to each. That is 230 yards of distance, in the dark, with 2 active manufacturing buildings between them and no direct line of sight. He looked at Dale Pruitt. You identified a specific individual at 230 yards, at night through 2 buildings, by the way he walked. Pruitt's voice held, but his eyes moved to the prosecution table and back. I've known Raymond Cole for 4 years. I know how he moves. His walk, Nathan said carefully, at night, at 230 yards. He let the jury keep that for a moment. Then, Mr. Pruitt, is it true that 10 days after Victor Greer's death, you were promoted to lead overnight security coordinator, a position that carries a pay increase of $7.40 per hour? Pruitt blinked. That was a standard progression. Who authorized it? Pruitt hesitated. Mr. Calloway, Elliot Calloway, Nathan said, the vice president of plant operations. The same Elliot Calloway who oversees all personnel classifications at Bridgeford Industrial. Nathan set the aerial layout down. No further questions, he sat. The jury did not react visibly. But a seed does not announce itself when it lands. It just lands. While Nathan worked inside the courtroom, Claire was outside of it. She had taken emergency personal leave from the Nashville Courier, which was a generous description of what had actually happened, which was that she had walked out mid-story and called her editor from the highway and said she would be in touch when she could. She did not care about the career implications. She cared about one thing. Claire started with the financial records. Bridgeford Industrial was a mid-size private manufacturer with publicly available state safety compliance filings. She pulled every filing for the past 7 years, cross-referenced them against the plant's own internal maintenance logs, which a former employee shared with her under condition of anonymity, and began constructing a timeline. What she found was not a maintenance problem. It was a pattern. Victor Greer, working in coordination with Elliot Calloway, had been systematically inflating equipment repair costs in the company's safety compliance reports. They contracted with 2 shell companies, neither of which had a physical address or a verifiable workforce, invoiced Bridgeford for work that was never performed, and divided the proceeds through a series of wire transfers that had been structured carefully enough to survive a casual audit, but not a careful one. The scheme had been running for at least 6 years. The dollar figure Claire arrived at, based on the records available to her, was $412,000, possibly more. Raymond had stumbled into the edge of it without knowing the full shape of what was beneath. As the maintenance crew lead, he was the person whose hands were actually on the equipment that was supposedly being repaired and replaced. He could see what was wrong because he was the one who had to work around it. He had reported the discrepancy to Victor Greer first. Greer had told him the records were accurate and to stay in his lane. So Raymond had gone over Greer's head and filed a formal discrepancy report with the regional safety director, which meant the report landed in a chain of communication that eventually reached Elliot Calloway, the man Greer was running the scheme with. 3 weeks before Greer's death, Raymond had gone one step further. He filed a request with the Tennessee Department of Labor and Workforce Development for an independent safety audit of Bridgeford's equipment maintenance records. If that audit had been completed, the entire fraud would have unraveled. Both Greer and Calloway would have faced federal charges. Claire called Nathan from a motel room at 12:47 in the morning. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who has been working alone for too many hours and has just found the thing they were looking for and needs to say it out loud before they can fully believe it. "Nathan," she said, "this wasn't a random accusation. Greer and Calloway were running a 6-year fraud scheme and Dad found it. He filed for an independent audit. If that audit goes through, Calloway loses everything. Someone killed Greer to collapse the trail before the auditors arrived, and they needed someone to take the blame. Someone who already had a public conflict with Greer on record. Someone who the county would be prepared to believe was guilty before the evidence was even presented." Nathan was quiet on the other end of the line for 4 seconds. Then he said, "And he was black in a county where that's been enough to close an argument for 150 years. The picture had a shape now. The problem was that pictures and evidence were different things, and the distance between them in a courtroom was the distance between freedom and a life sentence. Elliot Calloway had not gotten to his position by being careless. The pressure came quickly. 2 plant workers who had agreed to speak with Claire about the maintenance discrepancies stopped returning her calls within 48 hours. One of them reached her from a blocked number and said, very quietly, "I have 3 kids in school and a mortgage. I can't be in this. I'm sorry." The line went dead before she could respond. Then her editor at the Nashville Courier called. His voice had a particular quality, careful, and measured in a way it wasn't when he was speaking for himself. "Claire, you're on personal leave. You are not authorized to conduct reporting on behalf of the paper during personal leave. If you're using your press credentials in a way that intersects with an active criminal proceeding, we are going to need to discuss your employment situation when this is over." Claire understood what that meant. Someone had made a phone call. Someone with the kind of professional reach that gets through to newspaper editors. Someone who wanted her to stop. She set her phone down on the motel room table, carefully. Then she picked it up and scrolled to a name she had found 2 nights earlier in a set of old company directory files, buried under a list of employees whose accounts had been deactivated in a compressed period of time, 7 weeks after Victor Greer's death. Eleanor Marsh, Administrative Coordinator, Bridgeford Industrial, 21 years of service, quietly separated from the company 2 months ago. Claire did not know what Eleanor Marsh knew. She did not know if the woman would answer the door. She knew only that somewhere in Clarksville, on a street she had looked up on her phone, there was a truth that had not yet been spoken, and her father was in a county jail holding a crayon drawing in his wallet that had been folded and unfolded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. Claire drove to Eleanor Marsh's house at 11:15 that night. It was a small single-story house on Ridgewood Court, the kind of house with a porch light that had been left on by habit and curtains drawn with the particular completeness of someone who has decided not to look out. Claire knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Then she spoke to the door, not loudly, just clearly. "Mrs. Marsh, my name is Claire Cole. I know you worked at Bridgeford for 21 years. I know you were let go 2 months after Victor Greer died. I'm not here as a journalist. I'm here as a daughter. My father is in a jail cell right now for something he did not do, and I believe you know something that could matter. I am asking you to help him." The street was completely quiet. Claire stood on that porch and felt the seconds do something they only do when everything is on the line. Then the deadbolt turned. Eleanor Marsh was in her early 60s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck and gray hair that she had not bothered to put up at this hour. She looked at Claire the way people look at something they have been expecting to arrive, and had not been able to decide whether to dread or welcome. She stepped aside. What Eleanor told her took 45 minutes and changed the shape of everything. On the night Victor Greer died, Eleanor had gone back to the plant after hours to retrieve personal documents from her office. She had been made aware 2 weeks earlier that her position was being eliminated, and she had gone back that night to make sure certain files she kept, years of careful records she had maintained on contract discrepancies that no one had asked her to maintain, were safely in her possession before the office was reassigned. She had been walking through the east corridor, past the administrative wing, when she heard sounds from the direction of the secondary storage facility. She had assumed it was a late shift. Then she had turned the corner near the loading corridor exit, and Elliot Calloway had been standing there. His jacket was torn at one shoulder. His right hand was gripping his left forearm. His face was flushed and wet, and his eyes, when they found Eleanor's, went very still in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. He said with no preamble and no expression, "Eleanor, you were not here tonight. Do you understand me? You were not here." 3 days later, Eleanor received her official separation notice. Her pension, 21 years of it, was administered through a plan that Elliot Calloway had signatory authority over. The message was not spoken. It did not need to be. Claire asked her why she hadn't gone to the police. Eleanor looked at her hands. She had them folded in her lap, and she was looking at them the way you look at something you've been carrying for a long time, and have not yet found a place to put down. Because in this county, she said, when someone like Elliot Calloway tells you to be quiet, you stay quiet. That's how it works here. That has always been how it works. Claire leaned forward. Mrs. Marsh. It doesn't have to work that way tomorrow. Eleanor looked up. She looked at the young woman sitting across from her in her living room at midnight, a woman who had driven across the state and walked away from her career and knocked on a stranger's door in the dark for a man who was not the same color as her, but was in every way that actually mattered her father. And Eleanor Marsh understood something she had been working very hard not to understand for 2 months. Silence was not protection. Silence was just another way of choosing the wrong side while telling yourself you hadn't chosen anything at all. She agreed to testify. Nathan filed an emergency motion the next morning to call a new witness before the jury resumed deliberations. Douglas Albright was on his feet immediately. "This is a procedural stunt, Your Honor. The defense had every opportunity to build their witness list before trial. Introducing a new witness at this stage is textbook obstruction of the trial process." Nathan stood his ground. He cited Brady versus Maryland. He argued that Eleanor Marsh was a direct eyewitness to the movements of another individual at the location of the crime on the night of Victor Greer's death, and that suppressing her testimony would constitute a denial of Raymond Cole's constitutional right to a fair trial. "If this court refuses to hear this witness," Nathan said, "any verdict this jury delivers will not survive appellate review, and this court's decision will be part of the record that explains why." Judge Warren Castile was a Greystone County native who had been on the bench for 17 years. He read the motion for 38 minutes in his chambers. When he returned, his face gave away nothing. "The motion is granted," he said. "The witness will be heard." Eleanor Marsh walked to the stand in a courtroom that had gone quieter than courtrooms usually go. She was not a theatrical witness. She did not cry. She did not look at the gallery. She told the jury what she had seen, in the plain, careful language of a woman who had spent 2 decades keeping accurate records of things that other people preferred to remain vague. She described Elliot Calloway's location. She described his appearance. She repeated his exact words. She explained, without self-pity and without apology, why she had stayed silent and why she was here now. Albright cross-examined hard. "Mrs. Marsh, you waited months to come forward with this account. Why should this jury believe a story that convenient?" Eleanor looked at Douglas Albright with the patience of someone who has heard this question forming before it was finished. Then she looked at the jury. "I stayed quiet because I was afraid. Because that is what happens in this town when someone with Elliot Calloway's resources tells you to stay quiet. I am not proud of that, but I am here now. And I am here because a man who never did anything wrong to anyone is in that chair, and my silence has been helping put him there." When Albright sat down, the air in the room had a different quality, not dramatic, something more like the quality of air after a window has finally been opened. Nathan rose for his closing argument and spoke the way Raymond had taught him to speak, which was plainly, and without requiring the listener to meet him halfway. "My father, Raymond Cole, spent 22 years raising 2 children that this county said were not his to raise. He never asked for recognition. He never asked for anything. When he discovered that equipment at his workplace was failing because someone was stealing money that should have paid for safety, he reported it. He reported it because that is what he does. He does the right thing. That is not a theory. That is 22 years of documented evidence. That is why he is sitting here today. Not because of proof, because he was useful. Because someone powerful needed a person to stand between them and the consequences of what they had done. And Raymond Cole, a black man in a county that has historically found it very easy to decide the outcome before examining the evidence, was the most available option. You have heard the prosecution's case. A badge swipe that proves my client went to work. An argument that occurred 3 weeks before this man's death. One witness whose testimony cannot survive the basic geography of the facility where he claims he saw what he saw. And you have now heard from a woman who was present at that facility on the night in question, who saw with her own eyes another man leaving the area of the crime with a torn jacket and shaking hands, and the specific manner of someone who has just done something they cannot undo. Justice is not something that happens to you. It is something you build. Today, you are the people who build it. He sat down beside Raymond. Raymond looked at him, not with hope, not with fear. With the expression of a man who has seen something he spent 22 years trying to build standing on its own. The jury deliberated for 51 minutes. When they filed back into the courtroom, Claire was sitting in the gallery behind the defense table with her phone in her hand and her editor's number already on the screen. The foreperson was an older black woman in the second seat of the front row who had sat through every day of the trial with an expression that gave nothing away. She stood. She unfolded a piece of paper. On the charge of murder in the first degree, she said, "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." Raymond did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes closed, and he did not move. Nathan put his hand on his father's shoulder. Claire came from the gallery and put her arms around both of them. For a long moment, the three of them held on in the middle of a courtroom that had spent 2 weeks trying to pull them apart. Raymond opened his eyes. He looked at the two of them, both of them with tears running, and both of them with the particular expression of people who are exhausted down to a level that sleep doesn't reach, but who are still standing. He said the first thing that came to him. "You two, you grew up on me." Claire laughed. The sound filled the courtroom completely and without apology. In the weeks that followed, the story arrived in full. Claire's investigation was published in the Nashville Courier, and within 4 days every major outlet in Tennessee had picked it up. The reporting detailed the 6-year fraud scheme at Bridgeford Industrial, the shell company network through which Elliot Callaway and Victor Greer had extracted $412,000 from the company's safety compliance budget, the suppression of Raymond's whistleblower report, and the coordinated effort to construct a murder case against an innocent man who had been inconvenient enough to notice the truth. Federal investigators opened a criminal inquiry within 2 weeks of the story's publication. The evidence Claire had assembled, combined with the records Eleanor Marsh had kept for years in her own files, because something in her had always known they would matter eventually, gave investigators a foundation they described in later proceedings as unusually complete. Elliot Callaway was indicted on charges of wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. He did not accept a plea deal. He went to trial. He was convicted on all counts. At his sentencing hearing, Callaway addressed the court in a statement his attorney had clearly worked on for a long time. He spoke about the pressure of the business, about decisions that compounded in ways he hadn't foreseen, about how things had gone further than he had ever intended. The judge let him finish. Then she sentenced him to 23 years in federal prison, without the possibility of early release. As the officers escorted Callaway toward the side door of the courtroom, he passed the row where Raymond Cole was sitting. For a moment their eyes met. Callaway looked at Raymond with the expression of a man who has finally understood something too late to do anything with the understanding. Raymond looked back at him with the particular steadiness of someone who does not require the other person to be sorry in order to be at peace. Dale Pruitt pleaded guilty to perjury in exchange for a reduced sentence. The plant's operating board commissioned an independent review. Bridgeford Industrial paid a regulatory settlement of $1.2 million. Raymond went home. The house on Riverside Drive in Clarksville was older than it had been 22 years ago. The back steps where he sat with his coffee were weathered gray. The tree line at the edge of the yard had grown taller. The bookshelf he had built for Claire on Christmas Eve in the year the hours got cut was still standing in the hallway, a little crooked, absolutely solid. Claire took the crayon drawing, Our Family, and had it sealed in a clear, protective case. She placed it on the bookshelf Raymond had built for her. It sat there in the hallway under a reading light, the three crayon figures still recognizable. After all these years, the handwriting still a little uncertain about where letters were supposed to begin and end. One evening, about 3 weeks after the verdict, Raymond was on the back steps with his coffee. Claire sat on the step below him. Nathan leaned against the doorframe. The yard was going dark. The tree line was doing the thing it did at this hour, going from green to black by stages so gradual you only noticed when it was complete. Nobody spoke for a while. The quiet between them was the kind of quiet that is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything that does not need to be said. Raymond's phone was on the step beside him. He picked it up, looked at the screen for a moment. There was a name in his contacts he had not called in several years, an old friend from the years before Carol, a man named James who had moved away from Clarksville a long time ago. Raymond looked at the name, then he put the phone back down. When he finally broke the silence, he said something that neither Nathan nor Claire had expected. People always asked me why I took you two. I never had a good answer. He looked at both of them. I think I do now. He was quiet for a moment. I took you because I needed you more than you ever needed me. Claire shook her head slowly. Dad, that is the most ridiculous and most true thing you have ever said. 22 years before, a man had made a choice in a parking lot that cost him nothing in that moment, and everything in the years that followed, and was worth every single thing it cost. He had not done it because it was rewarded. He had not done it because anyone was watching. He had done it because 2 children were cold and alone, and he was the person who was there, and that had been enough of a reason. What he built out of that choice was the only thing that turned out to be strong enough to save him when saving was needed. Not the law, not the system, not the town that had watched his family sideways for 2 decades and offered nothing. His children. The ones nobody wanted, the ones he had chosen without being asked. They saved him the same way he had saved them, not with gestures, not with speeches, but with the simple refusal, absolute and quiet and unspectacular, to let go. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones who see us most clearly. Sometimes the choice that looks like sacrifice turns out to be the one that holds everything together. Sometimes the person everyone dismissed as inconsequential turns out to be the axis the whole thing was turning on all along. Raymond Cole sat on his back steps with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and his daughter beside him, and his son in the doorway behind him, and watched the yard go dark the way he had done 1,000 evenings before. He had carried a folded piece of cardboard in his wallet for 16 years. He had sat in a chair beside a child's bed through an entire night to answer a question that had nothing to do with words. He had stood in a school board meeting with a folder of grades and said, "This is the only answer I have." He had done all of this without announcing it, without requiring anyone to notice, without asking for anything in return. Dignity is not given, it is recognized. And the people who refuse to see it in others are the ones who ultimately cannot hold on to it in themselves. Elliot Calloway sat in a federal facility in Nashville, in the particular silence of a man who has spent 23 years learning what 22 years of a different kind of life looks like in comparison. He had built something real once, before the numbers started to matter more than the people the numbers were supposed to protect. That was the humanizing detail that did not excuse anything. It just meant the waste was complete. And somewhere in Clarksville, on a back porch on Riverside Drive, a man who had worked maintenance his whole life and raised 2 children the world said were not his to raise, and spent 3 weeks in a county jail for a murder he did not commit, and never once stopped being exactly who he had always been, sat in the dark with his coffee and his children and the tree line going black at the edges, and was, in the specific quiet way that matters most, entirely at peace. If Raymond's story stayed with you, if it reminded you that a person's worth has nothing to do with their job title, the color of their skin, or the assumptions other people make before they know a single true thing about them, then you already know the lesson. Dignity is not given, it is recognized, and the people who refuse to see it in others are the ones who lose it themselves. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depths, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.